The first thing the young Marine noticed that morning was the silence. It was wrong. The air over the Solomon Islands was never truly quiet. Even before the engine started, even before the pilots walked out across the steel matting of the runway, there was always sound. Insects in the jungle. Distant artillery. The dull thud of bombs carried by the wind. But on that morning in late August 1943, the silence pressed down like a warning. The kind of silence that made men look up at the sky before they even knew why. By mid-1943, the war in the Pacific had turned into a brutal contest of endurance. The jungles, the heat, the rain, and the endless attrition had worn down both sides. The Solomon Islands campaign had become a grinding fight where every airstrip, every harbor, every hill mattered. Air superiority meant survival. Without it, ships burned, convoys vanished, and soldiers on the ground were left alone under enemy bombers. And yet, despite the massive American industrial advantage, something was wrong in the skies. The Marine pilots flying the new Corsair fighters had arrived with confidence. On paper, their aircraft was a masterpiece. It was faster, stronger, and more heavily armed than anything the enemy had. Back in the United States, engineers and test pilots had spoken of it with pride. They called it the future. The engine was powerful enough to pull the aircraft like a rocket. Its unique wings gave it strength and efficiency. In controlled tests, it outran everything it faced. It was supposed to dominate. But war does not take place on paper. Above the islands, the reality was different. The combat altitudes were lower than expected. The air was thicker, heavier. The dogfights were chaotic, sudden, and close. And in those moments, when speed meant life or death, the Japanese fighters seemed to slip away like ghosts. Time and again, Marine pilots found themselves in the same situation. They would dive from above, strike hard, and then try to chase. And every time, when the enemy leveled out, the gap would grow. The faster aircraft on paper could not catch the slower one in the sky. The frustration was immediate and dangerous. Pilots returned to base angry, confused, and shaken. Some blamed their own flying. Some blamed tactics. Others blamed bad luck. But as the weeks passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Missions ended with damaged aircraft, wounded men, and sometimes empty spaces in the formation where a friend had once flown. One pilot described the feeling later in a letter home. He wrote that it was like running in a dream. No matter how hard he pushed, no matter how fast he believed he was going, the enemy always stayed just beyond reach. Confidence began to erode. These were experienced men. Many had already fought in older aircraft and survived. They knew the difference between fear and reality. And reality told them something was wrong. In ready rooms, between missions, they spoke quietly about it. They wondered if the enemy had discovered some new technique. Intelligence officers examined captured aircraft. They found nothing unusual. No secret engines. No hidden upgrades. The enemy fighters were still lightly built, still fragile, still lacking armor. Yet in the one thing that mattered most in those low-altitude battles, they seemed to have an advantage. It was during this time that a staff sergeant named Daniel Reeves began to notice details that others overlooked. Reeves had never been a pilot. He had wanted to be. But during training, a small problem with his vision had ended that dream. Instead, he had become a mechanic. At first, he saw it as a disappointment. But over time, he discovered something else. He understood machines in a way that felt almost instinctive. He grew up on a farm in Indiana, repairing tractors and engines long before he joined the Marines. He learned to listen to machines, to feel when something was wrong, to notice patterns others ignored. In the Pacific, where spare parts were rare and equipment wore out quickly, that skill made him valuable. Reeves spent long hours studying returning aircraft. He talked to pilots. He read maintenance logs. He tracked performance, fuel usage, temperature readings. He noticed that many Corsairs came back cooler than expected after combat. That alone was not unusual. But the pattern was consistent. Cooler engines meant something. It meant power was not being fully used. At first, the idea seemed impossible. The engine was strong. The aircraft was advanced. But numbers did not lie. Something was preventing the engine from translating its power into speed at the altitudes where the fighting occurred. Reeves began to compare records from multiple squadrons. The same problem appeared again and again. The aircraft was losing speed in the exact range where battles took place. The more he looked, the clearer it became. This was not pilot error. It was not tactics. It was physics. The breakthrough came late one night when he studied technical manuals by the light of a single lamp. The propeller had been designed for high-altitude combat. The engineers had assumed that future battles would resemble those over Europe, high above the clouds. But in the Pacific, the war was being fought much lower. The propeller blades were set at a pitch optimized for thin air. In denser air, they could not bite efficiently. The engine was producing power, but the propeller was not converting it into thrust. The aircraft was, in effect, stuck in the wrong gear. The realization was both simple and terrifying. Because the solution was also simple. Adjust the pitch. But that was forbidden. Aircraft components were strictly regulated. Any unauthorized modification could lead to court-martial. If a pilot died because of an illegal change, the mechanic responsible could face severe punishment. The system existed for good reasons. War demanded reliability. Standardization saved lives. Yet Reeves had attended too many funerals. He had watched pilots he respected walk out to their aircraft and never return. He had listened to their frustration. He had seen the evidence. One evening, after a particularly costly engagement, he made his decision. He gathered two mechanics he trusted completely. He explained the problem. He showed them the calculations. They understood the risk immediately. They also understood the stakes. Under cover of darkness, they began. The work was slow and precise. The propeller had to be removed. The blades heated carefully to avoid weakening the metal. Every movement measured. Every adjustment calculated. If they made a mistake, the aircraft could fail in flight. Hours passed. Sweat mixed with grease. The jungle hummed around them. They spoke little. Each man understood the danger. By early morning, they finished. The aircraft looked unchanged. No one would notice the difference. But everything had changed. The next day, the modified fighter was flown on a routine patrol. The pilot knew nothing. At altitude, he pushed the throttle forward. The difference was immediate. The aircraft surged. The airspeed climbed beyond expected limits. The response felt sharper, more alive. For the first time, the aircraft behaved the way it had been promised. After landing, the pilot demanded an explanation. Reeves told him. Within days, more aircraft were modified. Quietly. Carefully. Word spread faster than orders. Other units visited. They observed. They copied. Desperation overcame regulation. The next engagement told the story. The Marines intercepted an enemy formation. This time, when the enemy tried to escape, the gap did not grow. The Corsairs stayed with them. They dictated the fight. They attacked, disengaged, re-engaged. The enemy losses were severe. Pilots returned exhilarated. For the first time, they felt in control. Results followed quickly. Kill ratios climbed. Confidence returned. Morale surged. But success attracts attention. Reports reached higher command. Investigations began. Questions were asked. Regulations had been violated. Lives had been risked. At first, the response was harsh. The modifications were called reckless, dangerous, unauthorized. Then the data arrived. Performance records, combat results, engineering analysis, independent review. The evidence was overwhelming. The changes worked. More importantly, they were safe. Gradually, the tone shifted. The criticism softened. The focus moved from punishment to adoption. Within months, official orders standardized the adjustment. Factories updated specifications. Aircraft across the Pacific received the improvement. The impact was profound. The Corsair became one of the most dominant fighters of the war. Pilots used its speed to control combat. They climbed, dove, and disengaged at will. Survivability improved. Enemy losses increased. The war did not end because of one modification, but many pilots survived because of it. As the campaign moved forward, Reeves returned to his routine. He trained younger mechanics. He emphasized observation, adaptability, and courage. He never received public recognition. Few outside his unit knew his name. But those who flew the aircraft knew. Years later, one of the pilots who had tested the first modified fighter spoke about him. He said that wars are not won only by generals and machines. They are won by individuals who refuse to accept failure when lives are at stake. The story spread quietly through military training. It became an example of field innovation, of listening to those closest to the problem, of understanding that real combat reveals truths no test can predict. And perhaps the most important lesson was this: technology is never perfect. Plans are never complete. Reality always intervenes. The difference between defeat and victory often lies in the courage to question assumptions. In the jungles and skies of the Pacific, where heat, fear, and exhaustion tested every man, one mechanic chose to act. He did not change the course of the war alone, but he changed the outcome of battles. He saved lives. He proved that sometimes the smallest adjustment can create the greatest impact. And long after the war ended, long after the aircraft were retired and the islands grew quiet again, the principle remained. Innovation does not belong only to experts. It belongs to those who see the problem, refuse to ignore it, and take responsibility when it matters most. Because history is shaped not only by power, but by people willing to act when everyone else hesitates.